Welcome to Past Forward's continuing series, Travels Along the Old York Trail. Carolyn Stephens will be our guide for the journey as we follow the path that was once traveled by many of our ancestors who settled in the area. In today's episode, we learn some of the history of the founding of Charleston, Illinois, and are introduced to a few of the prominent citizens who played an important role in the town's establishment.
Hi, I'm Carolyn Stephens, and I'm telling stories along the Old York Road. The property owner here has given me permission at 1520 Harrison in Charleston, Illinois, and has shared what he knows about this property. The house that once stood here was called the half-mile house because it was a half mile to the courthouse. This is a place where horses, thirsty, worn out, rested from their journey to Charleston. They drank from a water trough pumped from a hand-dug well. It was filled up and capped at some point in time. The house that stood here has been torn down. Whichever way one traveled to Charleston in the 1800s, the journey was treacherous with ruts in the dirt road. Travelers suffered greatly from cold, freezing, or suffocatingly hot weather. Passengers slipped, slopped, froze, and roasted in the heat, and more likely than not had to walk miles next to their horse or carriage. One stagecoach driver froze to death on his journey. Mail was carried by horseback and later by stagecoach. While this half-mile house was a possible mail stop early in Charleston's history, there have been 4 different stagecoach stops that existed. Charles Morton's combined grocery, post office, and home was one of the early ones. Coles County history records that a Mr. Mole was the first man to carry mail to Charleston. He was over 6 feet tall. His feet almost touched the ground on the pony that he rode on. The pony was loaded with mail bags. People flocked to Mr. Morton's post office on mail day to get their mail and greet Mr. Mole. The half-mile house here stood at the crossroads of the Paris to Shelbyville Trail, which traveled east to west, and the Old York Road, which traveled south to Old York on the Wabash River. This was over 50 miles from here. It took a horse and wagon 8 to 12 hours depending on the weather and trail conditions. Early investor Nathan Ellington traveled to Palestine, Illinois, where the land grant office was located, and obtained a land grant authorized by Martin Van Buren, president, August 10, 1838, of the 40 acres here, where this half-mile house once stood. With the crossroads of the York Trail and the Paris to Shelbyville Trail, this would have been a wonderful investment. Ellington purchased other property in Charleston for speculation of making a profit. Another piece of property was at 218 Jackson Avenue, where in 1834 Dennis Hanks squatted. Hanks built a 3-room log home thinking he had purchased that property from Nathan Ellington. He never received a deed. Hanks also lived upstairs over Adolph Monroe's tavern, and his shoe shop was behind the tavern. That's another story. Abraham Lincoln stayed in Dennis Hanks' home many times when he was in Charleston. Nathan Ellington was much involved in organizing Coles County and the city of Charleston. He was the first Coles County clerk in 1830 and was the county circuit clerk 1840 to 1855. He also helped start the Agricultural Association, which led to the Coles County Fair. Nathan Ellington and his wife Fanny had 6 children. They lived just around the corner at 901 11th Street. They had a beautiful home. The Ellington family cemetery was behind the house in the field. The Charleston School District purchased that property in 1999 and moved all of the burials over to Old City Cemetery on the west side of town. Coles County was established on Christmas Day in 1830. Before that, it was Clark County, and before that, it was Crawford County, and went all the way to Chicago. Charleston was surveyed in 1831 and became the county seat in March of 1831. Charleston's named after its first postmaster and grocer, Charles Morton, Charles Anton, though some say it was named after Charles Easton, another settler. The town was organized as a village in 1835 with Ellington's help and incorporated as a city in 1865. The original courthouse was a log house down by the town creek between 6th and 7th Street, not far from here. A much nicer courthouse was built in 1835, where the current courthouse sits. Locals call the courthouse area the Charleston Square. Nathan Ellington's daughter, Nanny, as she was called, was just 17 when she fell in love with a dashing young man, Adolphus Monroe. Adolph, as he was called, had moved to Charleston from Kentucky with his parents in 1840. The two lovebirds married against the wishes of Nanny's parents. Fanny thought Adolph was not good enough for her daughter, even though Adolph's parents were upstanding, prominent Kentucky family, were educated and well-to-do. The Ellington family, though, had prestige in the budding town of Charleston and political influence in the court system. Many historical accounts say Fanny thought she was the cream of the crop and no one was good enough for her. Fanny hated Adolph and spread gossip and rumors around town about his character and drinking habits. Some historical accounts say she poisoned her husband against Adolph, who then cut Nanny out of his will, unless she left Adolph. By this time, Adolph and Nanny had a baby daughter, May, who was born with a club foot and would be a cripple the rest of her life. Adolph provided for and was a loving husband and father to Nanny and May. Of course, Adolph was mad as all get out about Nanny getting cut out of the will. He called his mother-in-law some choice names, none of which I can repeat here. But another problem was brewing, which involved Fanny's brother, who owed money to Adolph's brother. One day, Adolph was walking on the square in town when his father-in-law approached him. The two argued and then walked to Adolph's brother's drug and dry goods store to settle the argument. The store was on the northwest corner of the square across from the courthouse. The argument escalated, and Nathan started whacking Adolph with his cane with great force. In the heat of the moment, Nathan Ellington, who outweighed and was much larger than his son-in-law, picked him up, threw him on the counter in the store, and kept beating on him with his cane, yelling he was going to kill him. Adolph, who always toted two guns on his body, pulled one out, shot and missed his father-in-law, dropped the gun. Then he pulled out the second gun. No one in the store bothered to break up the fight. Ellington grabbed a hold of Adolph's hand and with his other hand kept beating. A bystander finally pulled Ellington off of Adolph. When Adolph's hand was free, he pulled the trigger. Ellington, mortally wounded, fell to the floor. He died a week later. Adolph was arrested for murder and thrown in jail by Sheriff Ambrose Yoakum, who was Fanny's brother. The trial was presided over by Judge Harlan, a friend of Ellington's, and A. Kitchell was the prosecuting attorney. Captain William B. Sims and Orlando Ficklin appeared for the prosecution, all friends of Nathan Ellington's. Ficklin was a lawyer and congressman and owned property right next to Nathan Ellington, that way. Adolph, who was educated and well-versed, represented himself in the week-long trial, though General W.B. Lyndon appeared for him. Adolph was found guilty and received a death sentence to be hung in February. Illinois Governor Joe Aldrich Matson granted a stay from the February date to May of 1856. Governor Matson was in a bit of trouble himself for fraud. I'm sure he just wanted to get the request off his desk. James T. Cunningham, another brother-in-law of Ellington's and a very influential person in Coles County, spearheaded and organized a lynching mob. Ellington's son, James D. Ellington, helped. Dennis Hanks was listed as one of the organizers, as were many prominent men in Charleston. This was a classic case of mob mentality. Publicity for this event was spread miles around. So on February 15, 1856, between 4,000 to 5,000 men, women, and children descended on Charleston for the thrill of seeing a man lynched. Coles County had a population of about 9,100 at the time. Probably most of the guests didn't know Adolph Monroe or Nathan Ellington. They were there for the party. Lynchings at that time in our history were considered an event one took their family and a picnic basket to. People came all around. The collaborative group mob mentality was in full swing. People were excited and part of the energized whole. Lynch, Adolph. Lynch, Adolph. The ringleaders dragged Adolph out of his cell. History reads that Adolph must have been drugged prior to being pulled out of jail, as he appeared not to know what was going on. The mob dragged him down the road west of town a few blocks where the town branch flows through Kiwanis Park and strung him up on a huge old tree limb until dead. After they were assured Adolph had died, the ringleaders cut him down, threw him in a wagon bed, and paraded his body around the Charleston Square. They finally released his corpse to his sister, who had been begging the whole time for his body. Adolph, while in jail, wrote his memoirs, which were published a few years later. He asked his wife, Nanny, to take his body back to Kentucky to bury him. He also asked her not to raise their daughter in Fanny Ellington's home. Nanny, with May, was interviewed sitting on Nathan's coffin at the train station where they were headed to Kentucky. Nanny chose to not put herself back in that Fanny home environment. She buried her love and moved to Kentucky herself. She later remarried. Her husband adopted May, and they moved to Florida. Researchers have told me that James D. Ellington, Nathan's son, committed suicide on July 10, 1867, and a few days later, Fanny Maria Yoakum Ellington committed suicide on July 21, 1867. I'm ending this story with a quote from Adolph Monroe's memoirs in jail. "A law which cannot protect a man should not condemn him." The York Road has seen a lot of drama. However, even with tragedy, our ancestors who lived, loved, and died along this York Road were amazing. We are here because they survived. Thank you.
We hope you have enjoyed this presentation. Stay tuned for more interesting stories to follow as we continue our journey with Carolyn along the meandering path of the Old York Trail.